This is the study session on economics and the reading on aggregate output prices and economic growth. Before I get to the slide deck, let me just remind you that we're kind of shifting from demand and supply topics, which is a microeconomics analysis, to things like aggregate output, which is a macroeconomic analysis. So we're moving from decisions that individuals and entities make regarding economic output, and we're going to focus on the macroeconomy, which means that we're going to have individuals acting collectively, we're going to have entities acting collectively, and then we're going to have the added specter of government influence. So let's get right to the LOS. Calculate and explain gross domestic product using two methods, expenditure and the income approaches. So remember what gross domestic product is. It's really a measure of the total size of the economy. In the US, in the year 2018, the gross domestic product is around $20 trillion. And there are two ways to compute that $20 trillion. One is the income approach, which takes a look at all of the income that is generated by the various entities that are out there, versus the expenditure approach, which is how much money that those entities spend during the course of the year. So they should arrive at the same value. Let's take a look at the income approach. Aggregate income earned by all households, companies, and the government for a given economy at a given time period. And so GDP is equal to total national income, which is from households and companies and governments, plus sales tax, plus depreciation. Remember that businesses invest in long-term assets and they get to depreciate those things over time. That depreciation expense is a non-cash expense that has some tax implications. And then you have to add the net foreign factor income. For a country like the United States, it's not too big of a deal. This is essentially, let me give you an example. If I were to go and teach over in England, I would get paid a salary over there. Let's say it's 75,000 pounds. But let's suppose a professor who lives in England came over and taught in the United States, and that professor made, well, whatever the exchange rate is, some number of US dollars. They kind of cancel each other out. So that net foreign factor income is the income generated by US citizens in other countries versus what other country citizens generate while working in the United States. The expenditure approach examines GDP from the different perspective, the total amount spent on goods and services. So we have gross private consumption and gross private investment. So those are the individual spending and business spending and investment. And then you add government purchases to that. And then you take the difference between exports and imports. Two methods for the expenditure approach. And one simply just takes the value at each stage. The other one looks at the end of value. And so the sum of the value added, you can see the example here where we start with 40 cents, where a farmer sells a commodity to a milling company, and then the milling company does whatever millers do, and they turn it into flour, send it to the baker, send it to somewhere else, send it somewhere else. And so you sum the two columns and you're going to get 140. Notice the easier of the two is just wait until the end. That's called the value of final output. And they're going to arrive at the same answer. Some of the value added has more granular details. There's a good word for you to use, granular. Compare nominal and real GDP. So the difference between real and nominal is that the nominal considers the effects of inflation. Real GDP represents market value if prices do not change over time. So there you have that change in price, which is the effect of inflation. So let's take a look at a quick example here. if in back-to-back years automakers sell 1,000 cars, but the price goes up from one year to the next, how does that affect GDP? How does that impact some kind of evaluation on the auto industry? And so really all we need to do is take the percentage difference between the 21 and the 20,000, and that gives us a GDP deflator of 102.07, but that's actually the rate of inflation, and so 2.07 is the inflation. I guess we'd have to say that this is the inflation. We'd have to be specific to this example. This is the inflation in the auto industry, and so the inflation in the economy would be an average of all those different inflations for the different products. But in real terms, there was no change in GDP, right? We started with 1,000 and we ended up with 1,000, and so 1,000 cars and 1,000 cars, that would be 0%, but the inflated economy would be the 2.07%. Next LOS asks us to compare GDP with national income and personal income and disposable income. And so remember what we've been talking about here. GDP measures value of all goods and services in the economy. And on the other hand, it measures total income. And so these two ought to be equal. All right, the GDP expenditure formula looks an awful lot like cash outflows. So we have consumer spending, we have business investment, we have change in inventory. So that's plus if they go up. Government spending, that's a plus. And government fixed investment, that's a plus. And then the relationship between exports and imports. And then, because the size of the U.S. economy and virtually all economies throughout the world are so massive that it's virtually impossible to decide on an accurate number for all of these input variables, and so you finalize it with a statistical discrepancy. On the other hand, the income approach computes GDP as national income plus the capital consumption allowance and the statistical discrepancy. And that capital consumption allowance is, if I go back to, how far back do I need to go? I need to go all the way back there. The income approach, that's the depreciation. All right, thank you for allowing me to go back. All right, so that's kind of the general formula, but where national income represents income received by all these factors, then we can identify the various national income inputs that go up into that GDP formula. So compensation generated by employees, profits, interest income, net income from businesses, rent, and then indirect business taxes, and then we subtract out subsidies. So that gives us national income. Personal income is going to be just a redirection of that formula, but just think about it from a reasonable common sense standpoint. We start with national income, and then we take out taxes, and then what could have been profits that were distributed, and then some transfer payments. That gets us personal income. Now, disposable income is the personal income minus all personal taxes. And the important thing here is that it measures the purchasing power after all taxes have been paid. Let's go ahead and look at the fundamental relationship between and among savings, investment, fiscal balance, and trade balance. Savings and investment are inversely related. When we generate a household income, we have several choices. We can either spend it or we can save it. And if you're anything like my household, with 6 of us here, we do lots of spending and we don't do hardly any investing. Here's the formula that relates the GDP to savings investment, where we're going to sum the consumer spending and business investment, and then here's that government spending in there, and then the net effects of importing and exporting. three ways to absorb savings, right? They can go into investment, they can finance government deficits, and they can finance trade deficits. And this is a big thing in the United States these days, especially from a political standpoint. There are some politicians who are very interested in the U.S. government deficit, and there are other politicians, and some are agreeing with each other that there are problems with our trade deficit. And so the savings equation looks like it does right in the middle there in the blue. And so you take the investment and you add the government deficit and add the trade deficit. And then you can rearrange to focus on the fiscal deficit. And so it's important to know that our deficit is a function of savings and investments, and then exports and imports. Next, LOS asks us to explain the Iist and the LM curves and how they combine to generate the aggregate demand curve. All right, this Iist-LM curve is a macro tool that illustrates the relationship between interest rates and asset prices and things like output. So Iist is the investment savings decision, and LM is liquidity money. And so I want you to think of the Iist relationship as our choice between saving and investing that is done on a personal level that's demanded by things like household budgets. You know, in our family, we spend lots of money on things like food. When our children, if they ever grow up and graduate from college and get jobs and become independent, we'll spend much less on food. But we also spend on things like college tuition and automobiles and energy and, of course, the PlayStation 4 games. Now, the LM curve, I want you to think about this in terms of the money market and interest rates and how the interest rates relate to our incentives to save. You know, quick example is that if money market interest rates here in the United States were, let's say, 10%, just for some strange reason, I probably would spend less on PlayStation 4 games. All right, two interpretations of the Iist-LM relationship explains the changes that occur in national income when short-term price levels are fixed, and explains the causes of a shift in the aggregate demand curve. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the curve. Explain the Iist and LM curves. So let's just look at the lower left green Iist1 curve and then the upper LM, upward sloping LM orange curve here for just a second. All right, the Iist curve represents the single level of output where the goods market is in equilibrium. All right, so what does that mean? I want you to think about it this way. When interest rates fall, that probably means that there are more opportunities for individuals and businesses to borrow capital. Of course, we're going to borrow when interest rates are low, and that means that productivity is probably going to increase. Output is probably going to increase. And so there's an indirect relationship. That's why that Iist curve is downward sloping. As interest rates fall, there's probably more output. Look on the horizontal axis, real GDP, there's probably more output because individuals are borrowing and businesses are borrowing. The LM curve represents the money market. It's the combination of interest rates and levels of real income for which money supply equals money demand. So here is a case in which the money market is in equilibrium. And the money market can mean lots of different things, but I want you to just think of it as available interest rates that are out there. Now, the intersection of that Iist and LM curve represents the aggregate demand curve, the total demand for final goods and services in an economy at any given time. And notice there's a lighter green. Is that maybe some blue in it? From Iist1 all the way out to Iist2, there's an outward shift in the Iist curve. And this can occur for a variety of reasons that's going to affect aggregate demand. Maybe consumers have different preferences. Maybe companies have decided, have been able to use labor and capital more efficiently, so that Iist curve shifts outward, and then that new aggregate demand equilibrium point shifts outward as well along the LM curve. And so you should see the relationship between investments and savings and the interest rate and productivity. Now, what about short and long run aggregate supply curve? So the aggregate supply represents the total amount of goods and services available in the economy at a given price level. Now, the aggregate supply curve represents the amount producers are willing to produce at each price level. So the components of aggregate supply are things like consumer goods, trade goods, capital goods, public and merit goods. All right, so combine all of those to get aggregate supply, total amount of goods and services. So not only does it include things like PlayStation 4 games, but it includes the service that I pay for to my local municipality. I pay $120 somewhere around there per year, so that my municipality contributes to a fund that's going to increase the quality of the water in the Chesapeake Bay. And I'm happy to pay $120 a year to improve the quality of the Chesapeake Bay if it increases the supply of the Maryland blue crabs that we like to eat every summer. All right, so think about that aggregate supply of all that stuff. Now, the long-run aggregate supply curve assumes that in the long run, all factors of production are variable. There's no fixed factor of production. I remember being an undergraduate struggling with this, at least initially. You know, I like to give my donut factory example in these videos. When I was in college, I worked in a donut factory, and, you know, I think about that, and, you know, that factor of production was fixed, because we had machines and we had ovens and we had conveyor belts, we had all sorts of stuff, and that didn't change on a day-to-day basis. But one day I came in and the owners of the business decided to crash out the back of the building and expand. And so think of long-run aggregate supply as no fixed factors of production, because factories can be expanded, the labor supply can be increased, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those supply levels change only in response to expected economic profits and losses, and that makes perfect sense with my donut example. There's no way that the owners of the donut factory would have expanded their factory capacity if they thought they were going to lose money. And so a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve requires changes in the factors of production. Now, how about the short-run aggregate supply? This is where the quantity supply is very sensitive to prices. And of course, the quantity supplied increases as the prices rise. Of course, you know, the PlayStation 4 owners, if they could charge $100 for a game, then they'd produce lots and lots of games. But as of now, those games seem to be holding steady at $59 a game. Rising prices, of course, imply higher profits. And ultimately, I mean, think about what this says. Firms will increase wages in order to produce more. Yes, that's the traditional economic sense. Here in the United States, sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't. All right, here's the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is fixed, because it has a static value. That's why it's straight up and down. But the short-run aggregate supply curves can change. And so they're going to move, shift either outward or inward, depending on whether there are increases in wages and raw materials or decreases in those inputs. Now, what about movements along and shifts in aggregate demand and supply? So here's a good table for you to, kind of memorize aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves. as the price level increases, then aggregate demand curve, real money supply declines, the interest rates increase, investments and savings decrease, level of incomes decline. For the aggregate supply, as price level increases, business profits increase, they increase production. Maybe prices decline, yeah, businesses reduce production. And so that's kind of a cycle there for both of those. How about causes of shifts in the aggregate demand curve? Think about what aggregate demand is. It's the demand for all the goods and services. And so what's going to cause a shift? Of course, changes in household wealth, changes in consumer and business expectation. And this is a really important one, because if somehow I knew that I was going to get, let's just have some crazy number here. If I knew I was going to get a $25,000 raise next year, I'd probably start spending today, or at least I'd think about spending today. So those expectations are critical in determining shifts in aggregate demand. How about capacity utilization? Go back to my donut factory example, and then fiscal and monetary policy. So here is the side that, those first three bullet points, those are individuals and business decisions and business conditions. The bottom two then are the federal government's responsibility. And so what happens when the government decides to spend more money, let's say, for example? And this is what we know, at least in the United States, that every year the government decides to spend more money. And then monetary policy. I mean, this has been fascinating in the United States over the last 10 years. We had this whole thing about the Fed buying long-term bonds to raise the bond prices and lower those long-term bond yields to keep interest rates low. So those two are government influences on aggregate demand curve. How about shifts in the aggregate supply curve? And so, of course, wages, input prices, like for my donut example, the price of chocolate and the price of sugar, taxes and subsidies. Suppose the government came along and said, hey, every maker of donuts that are chocolate covered and cream filled get a subsidy of 25 cents per donut. Imagine what would happen then to that aggregate supply. That makes perfect sense then, that we're going to have a big shift. And then productivity and technology. I like to give the story of, I did a tour of a local bakery here where I live. And these executives for the bakery were so proud of their ovens. And the ovens, they make crackers and cookies and biscuits and stuff. And the ovens have to be 20 degrees here, and they have to be 600 degrees here, and then 300 degrees here, and then the crackers go through this thing. And the owners were just so proud of their ovens and the technology. And so that process took, to go from beginning to end, maybe it took 30 minutes. But if they could do it in 5 minutes, imagine how many more crackers that company could make. All right, how about fluctuations in aggregate demand and aggregate supply that will cause short-run changes in the economy and the business cycle? All right, so shifts in aggregate supply and demand will cause fluctuations. Of course, it will cause fluctuations in GDP and the business cycle. Now, there are two things here. We can have an expanding economy or a contracting economy. During an expanding economy, we have output increasing, so GDP increases. Hopefully, the unemployment rate falls. That's what the economic models predict, and then capacity increases. And then, of course, just the opposite occurs during economic contractions. And so, do you see the relationship here that aggregate supply and demand, which have all those different factors that we talked about in the previous slides, those things are going to help determine whether we have an expanding or a contracting economy. All right, how about types of cyclical changes here? So during recessions, what happens? Aggregate demand causes a leftward shift in demand. Leftward meaning left, meaning lower. GDP and price levels fall. Corporate profits, employment, commodity prices like sugar and oil, interest rates, and demand for credit, those things all fall. On the other hand, if we have inflation in here. Remember, inflation is the difference in price levels from one period to the next. And so there are lots of things that can cause inflation, like increased government spending, maybe even declining taxes. Oh, increase in money supply, that's certain to cause inflation, at least sometime. So what do we have here? We have the simple fact that aggregate demand is going to increase more quickly than the aggregate supply, because I may demand more donuts today, but the donut factory, it might take, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks, I don't know, maybe even longer to catch up with that in the aggregate. Increasing prices tend to lead to increased employment and productions. And then those corporate profits and employment and commodity prices and inflation, they all rise. How about stagflation, which is a combination of stagnation, which is a state of the economy in which it is neither really growing or contracting, and then periods of inflation. Historically, when economies expand too rapidly, consumers kind of get ahead of themselves and they start spending and spending and spending. So inflation goes up, right? They bid up the price of all of these goods because they have more money. They have more income, more disposable personal income. But what happens if there's inflation and there's no growing economy? Oh boy, so this is a problem. Very costly and difficult to address. So think about what happens. You have price levels increasing, but production and employment decrease. That is not a good combination. How about some equilibrium conditions in the macro environment? Long-run full employment. What does that mean? This is where the aggregate demand curve intersects the short-run aggregate supply curve right along the long-run aggregate supply curve. And this is the case under which capital and labor are fully utilized. And so what this means is there's equilibrium, there's an equality of potential GDP and then the equilibrium GDP. How about a short-run recessionary gap? This is going to be a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve in which price levels decrease. And of course, companies reduce production and employment. Short-run inflationary gap. There's a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve and the price levels rise. And then short-run stagflation, we've got price level increasing and employment falling, and that's a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. So what I would do is try to memorize each one of these, try to memorize which way the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve shifts, and then focus on price levels. How about full employment? So short-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when the aggregate demand curve intersects with the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so let's think about this from the first standpoint. When there's a decrease in aggregate demand, price level falls, unemployment decreases, and that's going to have a corresponding decline in aggregate supply. And so there's going to be a new equilibrium in which there's the same output but lower prices. There's an increase in aggregate demand. The output level becomes greater than normal price levels. And so employment is going to increase, and then inflation is going to increase. How about a decrease in short-run aggregate supply? Price increases as the supply decreases, of course, and a shortage, think about that way, and the output levels will fall. How about if there's an increase in short-run aggregate supply? There's going to be an unexpected shift to the right, and then output and income will increase beyond normal employment levels. And this intersection is probably temporary and maybe even extremely temporary. All right, describe sources, measurement, and sustainability of economic growth. Boy, this is a hot topic here in the United States. We've had 12 months of increases of GDP on an annual basis of more than 3%. It's the first time that's happened since the early years of the second George Bush presidency. So what are some sources of economic growth? Physical capital stock. Think about my donut factory. labor supply. This is not only the actual counting of the number of workers that are available, but also the number of hours worked. Human capital, I always think of Apple and its recent market cap that exceeds $1 trillion. Human capital, I just think of just as how smart people are, accumulated skills and knowledge of all workers. I mean, this is why firms go and interview college graduates, because they're just assuming that those college graduates are really smart. Natural resources, of course, this is a big one with focus on climate change these days. So some can be renewable and some cannot. And then technology. Think about my cracker factory with the ovens. All right, how do we measure economic growth? So the growth in potential GDP, growth in technology, growth in labor, and growth in capital. Now, the productivity of labor is part of potential GDP estimation. So just take the ratio of real GDP over aggregate hours, and then you can rearrange that to get potential GDP. I want you to think of it this way. Notice the LOS says to describe these sources of economic growth. And so, the focus doesn't have to be on actually making any kinds of calculations here, but just remember the relationship between what sounds like it's going to increase GDP versus what sounds like it's going to decrease GDP. All right, describe the production function. This is used to determine the underlying source of economic growth. And that the GDP and productivity grow typically due to the discovery of new technologies and an accumulation of raw materials, labor, and capital, which means that you have these, this human capital, you have these really smart men and women who are figuring out ways to more efficiently manage their raw materials, their machinery, and the workforce, in addition to advancing technology in computing and in machinery and in equipment and utilizing solar power and all sorts of stuff. Now, the production function has a couple of assumptions. The function acts as evidence for a decline in input when extra output will be obtained, and a percentage increase in input leads to increases in the output, positive returns to scale. Now, economic output is restricted by levels of input. Of course, that makes perfect sense. If capital grows at a higher rate than labor, capital becomes less productive. That should make perfect sense. The only way to maintain growth in potential per capita GDP is through technology. Two primary reasons for economic growth: productive inputs, capital and labor, and technology advances. And so the growth is a two-factor model. There's the function of labor and capital. That's the L and the K. And then there's a technology knowledge of A. So that's really all we've done here. That bottom highlight is kind of formalized in that formula there. Technology scale factor can be represented as the total factor productivity. So think about total factors. We have these inputs, whether it's capital or labor, they have an additive effect on growth. And the increases in total factor productivity has a multiplicative effect on growth. So the increases in inputs, so you think about this, that just means like you add one worker plus you add another worker. But if you add great technology, then those one workers plus the one worker, they can get twice the work done, right? But if there's better technology, they can get maybe 3 times the work done or 4 times the work done. So that's the difference between additive and multiplicative. Now, the problem is that TFP is really hard to measure, and so it must be estimated using, some returns to scale and diminishing marginal returns. And that takes us through this reading. Next up, we'll talk about business cycles.